Mr. O's Music.
Hello you lot and welcome to Mr. O's Music. I'm Mr. O and this is music I like. This week we're looking at a jazz guitarist of whom I have a few CDs. His name is Pat Metheny, and I should make it clear, this is by no means Pat Metheny's full discography. So, a bit of background. Pat Metheny has to date won 20 Grammys and is the only artist to have won a Grammy in 10 different categories. He is an extraordinarily versatile guitarist and has worked with so many people in so many different spheres that it is hard to define him. As well as having collaborated with almost every big jazz name you can think of, he's also contributed guitar solos to many pop musicians' albums, and the minimalist composer Steve Reich wrote one of his most well-known pieces, Electric Counterpoint, specifically for Pat to play. He's also been responsible for a number of innovations in guitar construction and has a number of custom guitars he regularly plays, including the 42-string Picasso 1. Pat Metheny's debut album was released in 1976, and his most recent was released just a couple of months ago in February of 2020. His most consistent collaborator throughout this time has been the pianist Lyle Mays, who unfortunately died in February of this year. Together, they formed the two central pillars of the Pat Metheny Group, which generally comprised a quartet of guitar, bass, keyboards, and drums, plus various other musicians as necessary. Jazz musicians have always been very keen to work with Pat Metheny. There is a story that Richard Bona, who is a very fine jazz bass guitarist, begged Pat Metheny to let him play in the Pat Metheny Group, and when Pat said he already had a bass player, Richard said he'd be happy just playing some percussion and doing some backing vocals, and sure enough, he did tour with them for a year in 2002 as percussionist and backing vocalist, and continued as a member of the group for the next 4 years, only occasionally picking up his bass guitar for a solo. Choosing one album from all of this is not easy, of course, because whatever you choose, you're going to be missing out on some cracking tracks from another album or two. I've decided to go with a live album, The Road to You, recorded live in Europe in 1993. And I can't even see it here now. Here it is. It has a lot of variety in it, and while obviously focusing on tracks from their most recent album of the time, it also contains some wonderful performances of favourite works from previous years. This album demonstrates the classic PMG setup, a quartet of Pat on guitars, Lyle Mays on keyboards, Steve Rodby on bass, and Paul Wurtico on drums. Additionally, there are two multi-instrumentalists, Armando Marsal and Pedro Aznar, who provide additional percussion, guitars, and backing vocals. Looking to see whether this CD passes the sufficiently destroyed by time test, I note that it only has a few scratches on the front and a broad crack on the back. The spool even has all of its teeth intact, which is pretty astonishing. However, this is made up for by the fact that the CD itself was horrendously misprinted at the factory, rendering the text completely unreadable. So that's something. Before we get into the music, I feel I should say a little bit more about Lyle Mays, and this isn't just because he's recently died. Pat Metheny is always the front man in the shows. Nobody else speaks, and even Pat says very little indeed, letting the music speak for itself. But the success of the Pat Metheny Group has always been, as I've mentioned, founded on a collaboration between Pat and Lyle. Pat Metheny's real skill lies in being a tunesmith. His melodies seem so effortless and natural, both those composed as heads, but also those he creates as part of his improvisation. Lyle, on the other hand, is all about the harmony. All of the group's best works have joint composition credits, and Metheny's many solo albums, particularly his earlier ones, while also excellent, do sometimes lack the frisson that Lyle's harmonic turns produce. It's a great pity we won't ever get the chance to hear more collaborations from these two musical giants. Anyway, enough of all that, let's get to the music. As with some of my more recent videos, I'll be focusing on a few tracks in particular and skipping over others, not because they aren't all great, but because I want to spend a lot of time on some of them and I don't want the video to last 3 hours. The album opens with the crowd all happily singing in unison the head to a Metheny and Mays composition that doesn't even appear on the album, Minuano. It sets the scene perfectly as they excitedly await the arrival of the band, and you hear them roar as the band come on and launch into Have You Heard? This is a typical piece from this period. Lovely, effortless guitar with keyboards floating over the top. On the repeat of the head, we are introduced to a very typical PMG sound, the half-scat vocals. Pat Metheny Group tend to use the vocals as an instrument, with doos and bahs taking the place of actual words, and we encounter this a lot in this particular album. Pat's improvisation is beautifully melodic. I used to find it hard to believe that these really were improvised, and it was only through a happy accident that would take way too long to explain that I saw Pat Metheny Group play the same set list twice in 24 hours in 2 different venues, and it was at that point that I came to realize that these improvisations really were just that, as they were completely different the second night, and the fact they sound pre-composed is simply down to Pat's amazing skill. First Circle follows. This is an absolutely classic track. It opens with a complex rhythmic ostinato consisting of seemingly random groups of 2 and 3, which produce the very silly time signature of 22/8. It goes something like... and so on. Over the top, a beautiful smooth melody is placed, sung and played on piano. Pat takes over with arpeggiated guitar following the complex rhythmic groupings. This arpeggiated section is then repeated, but this time with a gorgeous counter melody over the top and straight crotchets played on piano and glockenspiel. The final section of the head concludes triumphantly, and the music then calms, leaving Lyle Mays to produce a wonderfully melodic improvisation. Following this, we are led into an excited link with the 22/8 ostinato crunching away and a gently rising scale counterbalanced by burgling keyboards. We launch back into the triumphant third section of the head, which leads to me to the one small disappointment of this entire album. On the studio version, at this point, there is a new counter melody introduced by a second vocalist, which weaves around the original vocal melody and at the end reaches the tonic in triumph, a full bar before anything else does, and just sits there producing the most glorious major seventh clash. I know it all sounds very technical, so I'll just let you hear it now on the studio version. The point is, it produces a phenomenally strong emotional response, and in the live version, while you can hear Lyle playing this second vocal line on the keyboards if you know what you're listening for, it doesn't quite do it for me. It's still a great rendition of this classic, however. Following 2 tracks, each of which in turn has given Pat and Lyle an opportunity to show their improvisational skills, we are given a respite, with Pat Metheny leading in the beautifully relaxing The Road to You, with keyboard strings providing a lush backdrop. This is the first of 3 tracks that are unique to this album. Next comes the second of the unique tracks on this album, Half-Life of Absolution. It begins with almost 2.5 minutes of what I'm afraid I feel is somewhat self-indulgent messing about with reverb gates, percussion and silly piano chords. However, what then follows is one of my favourite pieces from the Metheny Mays stable. In a minor tonality over a bass alternating simply between the subdominant and flattened sixth, Pat weaves a beautiful sombre melody which begins on the tonic and continually returns to the home keynote throughout. The bass, however, only reaches the tonic itself twice, and this denial of resolution produces a huge tension which isn't even released at the end of the head, which concludes with an imperfect cadence. The solos begin with Pat Metheny in introspective mood, playing simple melodic snippets, never straying too far from the original melody. Underneath, however, Lyle is playing much more adventurous chords, and you can almost hear him warming up for what is to come, for it's when Lyle's improvisation begins that this piece really becomes very special indeed. He begins, like Pat, simply with long pauses for thought and small melodic ideas played in octaves. The textures he produces during this section, layering strings in and around the piano sounds, are beautiful. Alternating melodic lines with more and more adventurous chords, there are moments where it almost sounds like he's just hitting random keys, and yet you know every single note in every chord is perfectly calculated. The band build with him to a return to the head, which we are given again in its entirety, but with one small difference. You know, I said that at the beginning the tonic chord was being avoided like the plague, with the bass only playing it twice. Well, on the reprise, we don't even get that release. From halfway through the head, we are taken on a journey lasting a full 1.5 minutes, where the melody keeps reaching the tonic and the bass stubbornly refuses to follow. It's the most ridiculous exploration of the concept of the interrupted cadence ever, with substitutions for the tonic including not only the fairly traditional flat 6, but also major 4-9, flattened 2-7, flattened major 7-7. You get the idea. Basically anything and everything but the tonic. It's just unbearably squirm-worthy, and it works so well. Following this tension, a simple track is needed, and we get it with Last Train Home, a lovely track with a simple shuffle drumming and beautifully melodic improvisation from Pat, which stays thankfully close to the home key throughout. Another track from what was at the time their most recent album, Letter from Home, Better Days Ahead, has a lovely happy feeling with harmonica doubling of the guitar head, with utterly joyous improvisations from both Lyle Mays and Pat Metheny. Naked Moon, which follows, is the final track unique to this album, an utterly beautiful introverted piece of guitar music with gentle support from the rest of the band. Beat 70 is also from their most recent album at the time. A stupidly fast clave beat keeps it all ticking along, with short solos from both Lyle and Pat in the middle. This piece contains a great example of one of the slightly irritating aspects of Pat Metheny's work from this period, the annoyingly chipper conclusion. When he didn't know quite how to end a piece, he'd often just put in an overly cheerful, perfect cadence complete with jingly-jangly keyboards and glockenspiel, which somehow always seems to grate just a little bit. It's still a great track, though. Letter from Home, the final track from the album of the same name, is a beautiful ballad with nothing other than a melody being played twice through. I remember sitting down at a piano learning to play this by ear when it was first released. The chord sequence is just gorgeous and shows Metheny at his composing best. Third Wind is essentially the last track of the album, with only a small studio recording of an untitled guitar solo from Pat Metheny following it as a sort of lagniappe. Third Wind is an absolute tour de force of energy, with drums and percussion going full tilt and a beautiful melodic guitar and voice singing ahead over the top. The final phrase of the head, which of course the vocalist Armando Marçal has to sing in one breath at the top of his head voice, lasts almost 23 seconds, and I wouldn't believe he could do it if I hadn't seen him myself sing it live on a number of occasions. Pat then launches into a solo of intense energy, which pushes into a new section with exciting Latin American polyrhythms. At the opening of the final third section, a new head is introduced, which I assume is the third wind referred to in the title. This entire head feels like a coda, with, unlike the half-life of Absolution, a return time and time again to the tonic. Over this joyous chord sequence, Pat Metheny gets out his trademark analog guitar synthesizer, the Roland GR300, which, while it has been used by other guitarists, has a sound which has become inextricably linked with Pat. A short improvisation lets us hear a sound that is surprisingly absent from most of this album, as he screeches up the octave towards the end, playing the repeated, highly memorable and singable coda melody again and again. You can't help but smile. The album ends as it began, with the crowd cheering, now singing in unison the final few bars of Third Wind over and over again as they are faded out. This really is simply meant to be a taster to Pat Metheny Group, and I'd really encourage you to listen to this album, even if you don't think you're a fan of jazz. Pat Metheny Group have a real personal connection for me. I saw them for the first time while I was living in Montreal in 1989, when they played an open-air show as the headliners of the Montreal Jazz Festival, then in its 10th year, and by then the largest jazz festival in the world. It was the first time the group had ever played to a crowd of more than 20,000, and they played to over 120,000 that night. The energy was extraordinary, and since then I've seen Pat Metheny so many times that I've lost count. It's at least 7 or 8. For me, this group was the real entry point into jazz. I knew about jazz, and indeed I listened to quite a lot of it live before I encountered the Pat Metheny Group on McGill Avenue in 1989, but it was Pat's extraordinary ability to make an improvisation sound like a true melody rather than noodling which got me hooked. Do explore their other albums as well then, and if you ever get a chance, go and see Pat play. Be amazed at the faces he pulls as he reaches for the high notes on the guitar. Marvel at the fact that he only seems to have one stripy navy and white top, which he's been purchasing over and over again for the last 40 years. And wonder at the way he always describes his fellow band members as great musicians. But most of all, just appreciate his own great musicianship and the way in which he has, over the course of more than 40 years now, managed to surround himself with the best the music world has to offer. Thanks for watching. Do please subscribe, comment, click the bell. It's the best way to know when the next video arrives and to encourage me to make it. See you next time.
Mr. Music, Mr. Music.